It's also a delight to be here. I was slightly panicking at about 10 to 7 this morning as I was standing in Terminal 4 of Heathrow waiting for my bag to arrive from a week. I've just come back from a week in Nairobi. So it's actually warmer here. It's certainly a lot drier than it is in Nairobi at the moment. So it's a delight to be here, and actually to be here nicely on time as well. So thank you, Kenya Airways, for delivering me back in the UK. Okay, as Janice has said, I run my own business. It's called Fundraising Training Limited. There's no real secrets as to what we do. We train people in fundraising. So I'll give you a little bit of a brief introduction to me, and then I'll talk a little bit about my exposure to the world of trust. And then I wouldn't mind doing a little pause to find out from you folks quite what you want to know from today and how you want to know it, because we're going to be in this room, until 12:05? And I want you to feel that you can get the best value out of this presentation. You know, obviously I have things prepared, but there might be other ways in which I can address your particular questions. So just quickly, let's have a look at me. Just help to be able to use, what have I done with it? Oh, there it is. As Janice said, 31 years of begging for money. 31 years of begging for it for nearly every cause you can think of in nearly every context and locality as well. Now, I started begging for money as Janice pointed out, at Scope, and I was a community fundraiser there. But then I quickly converted across to high-value fundraising. So I started in the world of corporate fundraising and then moved into being director of marketing at an environmental organisation called Conservation Volunteers, where charitable trusts were the most important income stream. And I fell in love with charitable trusts then. It was 1988, I think. And here I am in 2015, still equally in love with charitable trusts. And the reason why I'm in love with them is they're so interesting. There's hardly a charitable trust out there when, if you scratch it, isn't where the money comes from, how the money's been managed, what they do with it, the personal family history behind it, the company history. They are all individual, fantastic stories and little insights into our culture and our heritage. And there's 8,000 of them. They're in every pocket of this country, so you will have them around the corner from your schools. And they give out, we reckon, about 1.4, 1.5 billion pounds each year. So there's a hell of a lot of money. And the other thing about charitable trusts is, and this takes me back as to where I come from, I'm an absolute self-confessed cheque sniffer. So those of you in the old school days of fundraising, when a cheque arrived, you just sort of run it across your nose and go, I raised that. It's not quite the same with banker's drafts and an email notification. You can't exactly embrace the screen in the same way. But I like them because they do, and actually still many of them still use cheques. And they write cheques with quite a lot of noughts on the end of it. So, you know, it's always a bit better to sniff something with lots of noughts on the end of it. And then at the end of the day, they are there to give money away. That is why they're there. So many of the other things that you get involved in other areas of fundraising, trying to persuade people to be philanthropic and then to choose what you're doing, these guys are already philanthropic. So it's all available for us. The other thing about them, as we're going to look at in a minute, is they do declare a lot of information about themselves, certainly in the UK. We have a sort of legal framework in this country where, as a charitable trust, you have to register with the Commission and you have to declare your annual accounts. And when you declare your annual accounts, you spill out your entrails all over for the public to crawl over, where you get your money from, how you spend it, who you give it to. And I think we're very lucky in this area to have so much information about where people give. Whereas in more private philanthropy, that's a very tricky thing, to actually find out where do you give, how much do you give. In fact, at the moment, and one of the reasons for going to Nairobi is I have a client out there. All right, it's actually a funding advisory body of one of the wealthiest families around the world. who had a lot of charitable trusts in this country about 20 years ago, which they took out of the UK and then lodged in Switzerland because of the transparency that they were suddenly having to be exposed to. I didn't quite like the idea of all of us, thousands of fundraisers, picking through their generosity. So we do have that wonderful thing with trusts. We have lots of money, we have a pre-existing commitment to give, and we also have a lot of information about them. And one of the things we're going to look at a bit today is quite what we can find out about them. The other thing, and this is for me as well, one of the essential art of raising money from trusts is often about writing. And they don't like a stupid story by and large. You have to give them quite a well thought through and well argued proposal. So if you enjoy writing and you enjoy understanding what you're raising the money for and you enjoy communicating it, it's a very good way of raising money. So the other thing we're going to do here is we're going to look at what goes into a good proposal. So those are my two main things really, is to give you an understanding of what you can find out about them so you can spot a good prospect, and then give you an idea of what goes into a fairly good proposal as well. So a little bit of me, at 31 years, 1984, auspicious year. I started being a trainer in 92, so I used to run the Directory of Social Change, all their courses in trust and corporate fundraising, and that was 92. And this is just a little bit of a slice of the type of organisations that I work with. This is just the last 10 years, because I set up Fundraising Training Limited 16 years ago, so it's got quite a bit of a pedigree now. And we've done work with the University of Oxford, Barbican Centre, Museum of London. We have a few schools on our roster, not a huge amount, but we do have quite a lot of educational establishments in the wider sense. But then I do stuff around the world, and particularly Africa. And at the moment, the thing that's taking me out to Nairobi and other places is working with the International HIV/AIDS Alliance and supporting their local organisations across the continent. So that's me. That's me. I'm intrigued about all these faces looking at me. Why are you here? I'm quite intrigued about whether it's because this is an area that you've been raising money for and you can't quite crack it, and you've tried and tried, or are you here because you're curious? Or people have said you ought to raise money from trusts and you're thinking, who are they? How do I do it? So I'll be really interested. A couple of calls from people. Why are you here? Is it because you want something you worked hard at? You want the golden bullet? Or have you got that? So yeah, it's curious. So yeah, anybody fess up with where they're coming from?
I've worked in the charity sector before coming to schools, and I've done trust and foundation.
Right.
So I suppose I'm intrigued to see whether there's any mileage in it for education for schools, public schools.
Oh, okay. So you've seen how it can work in the mainstream charity sector, and you're kind of intrigued, can this translate into this particular sector? Oh, okay. Yeah. So we've got a few hands on it. I'm Patrick, my dear friend. We've known each other 15 odd years.
You first trained me in 1993, so it's up to you if you've got any better since then.
Thanks, pal. As you know, I can pay you back on that one.
I come from a slightly different angle,
Yeah.
but I know I should be doing this.
Yeah.
The challenge that I find is that I'm finding it difficult within my schools, and I now have 4 schools to look after.
Yeah.
This sounds pathetic, I know, but to find something to raise, to actually put a bid in for. So, for example, we have been successful applying to Wolfson for when we were building new science labs. Yes, it's obvious, but actually going around and trying to find that something that I can say, yes, we could actually contribute to the budget by putting an application in for this, is actually the bit that's stopping me.
So you understand there's a market there, but it's actually what do we take to the market that's relevant.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's where I'm struggling.
Any other calls? The woman there.
I managed to have a little bit of success because we did some work on our chapel, but one of the things that I found as an independent school is that a lot of them won't do anything for independent schools.
Right.
And interestingly enough, one that I did actually state that it wouldn't do an independent school, but it still gave us the £1,000 because they said, in actual fact, if you persevere and if you come to
Okay, so you'll get a little fish thrown at you when there's a little bit of extra money in the pot. Yeah, that's really intriguing. I'm going to take three more. So 1, 2, 3.
I work at a school that is a foundation school. It was set up about 200 years ago.
Right.
So we have been raising from trusts and foundations for a while. We have about 30 to 40 who give to us. But they haven't been actively managed, and we haven't been engaging them in a
Right.
ongoing relationship. So I'd like to find out how we can strengthen that relationship, if they're even interested in strengthening the relationship.
Okay, so it's really about stewardship of a group. Tell me, can I ask a question? Have this not funded you more than once, or are they bulk of them have only had a little sniff of you once and then wandered off?
A lot of them fund us on an annual basis. They also will fund specific students
Right.
and fund them all the way through their education. And then some of them give annually to a general appeal,
Right.
and then some will fund specific projects.
So they are quite loyal. They've given to you quite a bit.
But we don't
Yeah.
have any communication with them, and I'd like to
Okay.
strengthen that.
Can I just put you on this, just a little poke? This isn't on my presentation, but I'll throw it in so you can take a little bit of notes. There are two things I'm doing at the moment that is helping sort of build some sort of fresh, actual factual knowledge about what goes on with this market. The first one is for the last few years, I've gathered 100 charitable trusts, which is a sort of cross-section of the market. So big ones at 50, 60 million income per year, down to ones that give. In fact, I've got the wonderfully named Sir Walter Big Charitable Trust. I just like the name, and actually partly why I like the name is the Sir Walter Big Charitable Trust is actually based in my hometown, Oxfordshire, in Wallingford. And Sir Walter Big was and this is an interesting story, and you'll resonate with this. Sir Walter Big was some 18th century wealthy merchant. And when he popped his clogs, he left a farm for the proceeds of which were to be spent on the education of young people in Wallingford. The town is 6,000 people. And so this trust had existed for about 200 or 300 years, and it's actually the site of where the comprehensive school is. So the state school is actually on Walter Big's farm. And then a few years ago, they decided to sell the original building, which is now on the farm, and the trust turned from one that had the only income source was the money from the county council to pay for the rent of the building to hold the school in, to one that suddenly became a very large housing estate with all the proceeds of selling the land. And so this tiny little trust turned into one that's several million pounds. And instead of having a few £1,000s to give away, it suddenly has got in excess of £130,000 to give away each year, which has to be spent on the education of young people in a town of 6,500 people. Now, I think, scratch your community, these things are all over the place. And what's really interesting is, a lot of them have had deposited land from centuries ago that are turned into supermarkets, that are turned into housing estates. And suddenly they have real estate which is generating no income, and then suddenly it's turned into an absolute bonanza. But what they can't change is the purpose of what the money's for. And so many of these trusts, and this is a really important point, so many of these trusts were created at a time when the principle of charity, education, is one of the 5 fundamental heads of charity. So nearly all of them got education in their remit. And as I say, they are changing. They're changing from owning rubbish farmland to now owning development estates that are worth several £1 million. So Walter Big's in my study. Anyway, what this study tells me, and I've got 10 years of data now from 100 trusts, 2004 to 2013, taking us through the economic crisis. The total amount of money that these trusts give out is about £320 million a year. The investments that they have are 7.5 billion. Now that's spooky, isn't it? I just pick 100 trusts at random, and I unearth £300 million worth of grants going into our sector, and I unearth £7 billion worth of investments, and that's 100 out of 8,000. What is interesting about them is 80% of these grant makers do not increase or decrease their grant expenditure wider than plus or minus 18%. So whatever's happening with their financing, they don't change it a lot. So one year it goes up by about 12%, and next year it might drop down by 8%, but it's in a very, very narrow line of change. So only 20% in the whole 10 years of this study have ever given grants that were larger than 18% over the previous year. The amount of them that have increased their grant making by more than 18% 2 years on the trot, fingers of one hand. So it's interesting when you're in a marketplace where you've got a number of trusts and you want to get more out of them, 80% of them haven't got more money to give you more. So be very careful about this market, because it is a very steady market, which has some real pluses. So when we had a financial crash of 5 years ago, trust did not collapse. But when we have a financial rise, trust will not rise with it. So this sort of loyalty and sort of reliability of their money is wonderful, but they are not as elastic and these great opportunities for transformation as a lot of people think they are. So sorry, that was a long-winded way of answering your question about what do you do with a basket. Just to say, be wary that they will only give you more money if they get more money, and 80% of them don't get that much more year on year. There are a couple of people that I was just going to ask.
So going back to the Rosie's point earlier about being an independent school, I'm in a state school, and we have a similar problem in that trusts will not fund things that they consider to be your core business. So like you, in a way, we're still having to look around the edges of things that are not core business. So
Yeah.
the same sort of issue across the sector.
Yeah, it is a tricky one, because they don't see it as their role to replace what the state can do. And that's another thing about them. They're very private. They don't have to be swayed or impressed by what is public and what is headline. So a lot of them like to be contributing to the unpopular, the real, the bad, the ugly, the unpopular. So if they think someone else is going to pick up the tab, they won't go for it. And I suppose that's, in a way, a little bit of the sort of, if someone else can pick it up, they pay for it. So you've got to make it really clear to them that no one else will pay for this. And whatever the problem, that smells of that, it makes it a lot more attractive. Final call.
Yeah, it's related to that point that you made earlier, actually.
Yeah.
We've had mixed success with trusts in the past, some good, some not
Yeah.
wanting to know. And I'm interested in how you cultivate a trust without people having to declare themselves out of the process when it comes to the board, and
Yeah.
also how to steward.
Okay.
So I don't think we've got that quite right yet.
I'll answer you directly now. And again, this is not something I necessarily prepared in the notes, but I think this is my personal obsession at the moment. So you're going to get my personal obsession, sorry. As well as this study of 100 trusts, 10 years, lots and lots of data, which I thoroughly enjoy going through. The other study I'm doing at the moment is I've got about 400 case studies of how did people get that big gift, and then how did they get it for the first time, how did they upgrade a donor. 90% of the case studies are UK charitable trusts, and then the other examples are individuals, companies, etc. And do bear in mind that 50% of high-value donations from individuals are charitable trust donations. And you'll know this from your own records, that those wealthy benefactors, they're using trusts as the vehicle for their philanthropy, because that's the way they do it. So the vast majority of major gifts in this country are coming through trusts in some shape or form. Anyway, I've got 400, and I'm interrogating them. And the question I'm asking is, who started the dance? So did the recipient organisation walk up to them and say, do you want to dance? Or did the funder turn to the charity or the organisation and say, hey, let's talk money? Quite a fundamental question for us as fundraisers. Anyway, having done my study, I'm up to 290 out of the 400 that I've interrogated. And after about 80, we found there are 5 ways of starting dances. And now I'm up to 280, we have not found a 6th way of starting a dance. So it seems at the moment that the categories are fairly strong. Now what I can't say, because it requires more data, is the distribution about within these 5, but I can give you the 5. Dance move number 1 is they come completely out of the blue. I was talking with a friend of mine who works for one of the big international development agencies dealing with visual impairment, and she said, I'm just leaving, but I think I've secured my £2 million gift. And I said, is it an individual or a trust? She says, well, it's coming through a trust. I said, come on, tell me, how did you get it, Katie? And she said, it came completely out of the blue. I had no idea that this person was on our radar, that they knew us, or that they had this type of money. They literally called us up and said, I'm interested. So pathway number 1 is completely out of the blue. When you actually scratch them, they're not always out of the blue because they're the result of, say, a TV ad or a program. But the key thing is you had no pre-existing communication with this donor, and you had no expectation they were going to give you that amount of money. So completely out of the blue is pathway number 1. Pathway number 2 is where you have a pre-existing dialogue, communication, and suddenly they decide to change the terms. So this funder is giving you 200, 300 pounds, and then suddenly they say, well, you know, we've just come into a bit of money, or we're changing things, and what would you guys do with, say, 100,000? Again, you can claim it because you're in a dialogue with them, but what you can't claim is you knew that they were a major gift prospect because they started that particular dance. And that's because their financial circumstances have changed. You know, numbers start, but they know you're around, so they contact you. Dance number 3 is where there is a known peer introduction. So the move probably does come from them, but you know that it's triggered because one of your existing funders or advocates alerted them to you. And again, that is a process you can manage, you can improve that. So that's pathway number 3. Pathway number 4 is a really interesting one. It's having an open shop. And what an open shop means is that you have opportunities to donors to come in and sniff you. That they're not coming into necessarily an overt cultivation event. What they're doing is that they're finding out what you do, and then as a result of having found out what you do, they make the move that say, hey, I want to talk about this in a different way. And I'll give you an absolute classic example. Small client of mine called the Centre for Social Work Practice. And they're like a sort of think tank and practice developer in social work. That's really emotional, isn't it? You can shake tins outside Sainsbury's raising money for that one. Anyway, they run quite a lot of training courses in social work practice. And they had a participant on one of the training courses who was there as a social worker. And then she approached the guy who runs it, the director, and said, I really like your organisation. I was fascinated by that course. How do you fund yourself? And he said, and clearly she was interested. So he invited her to come in and meet him in his offices. And then she just quizzed and then said, you might not know, but I'm actually, I'm a member of, we have a lot of charitable trusts in our family. And I have one in particular. How much does it cost to run this organisation? So he blurted out this figure, and she wrote him a cheque there and then. And has since funded the core costs of that organisation for the next 4 years. They would have only have found her because their shop door is open. So there's opportunities through the very work that they do for people to come in and have a sniff. And that is different from an overt cultivation event where someone is clearly, it's got fundraising all over it. This is about people having a chance to taste you and then make the next move. So that's 4, isn't it? Number 5 is proactive stalking. And that is where you identify them, you research them, you cultivate them, and then you clobber them. That's your classic fundraising. And that can be on a sort of a meshed basis where it's about relationship building, or it can be simply, you're applying to comic relief. So you're applying to everybody else to an open call. And those are your 5 pathways. I haven't found a 6th. The frightening question is, at the moment, the number distribution is heavily swung towards the first 2. That the proactive stalking isn't the primary way of getting major gifts, which is a bit devastating for someone like me because I run training courses on how to stalk people. And then when I stare at my own data, it tells me that it's not the answer. What's that wonderful thing? I think it's about, I don't know whose phrase it is. I've always attributed it to Benjamin Franklin, which is, there's no greater tragedy in life than to see a beautiful idea murdered by a gang of brutal facts. But I have 280 brutal facts telling me that targeting them, schmoozing them, donor cultivation plans, research profiles, all the stuff we live and breathe actually is only getting the crumbs on the table. However, sorry, I know I've done this. I did this at a conference recently, and I'm at Institute of Fundraising one, and everyone was in the room, so what's the point in us then? Okay, there's an interesting question about what is the point of you, guys. I did a piece of work, it's got nothing, not in our field, but it's in animal welfare, actually. I did a review of a large animal welfare organisation about 5 years ago, and said, oh, your fundraising's rubbish, you're chaos. What you need is proper research profiles. You need to get out there, research the market, understand it, profiles, know everything about them. You need donor development plans. You got to be planning your next move. You can't leave it to fate or to chance. So you need a much more systematic approach to your fundraising. Tracking systems, development plans, relationship management checklists, profiles, research tools. Even got a specialist researcher. So we tooled them up, and then they asked me to come back 5 years later and review it again. And actually their income had doubled. So I was feeling really smug, Give these guys the systems, make them clank every time they're fundraising because they're bristling with weaponry, and you double your income. And when we actually interrogated the growth, and I'm using this as a story because it illustrates what I see a lot elsewhere, the growth of the doubling of the money had come from unsolicited donations. So what was the point of all these systems? And I'll try and answer it. The desperate man clinging on to his theories and his 30 years of wisdom and professionalism, fellow of the Institute of Fundraising, guru of our sector, whatever rubbish is out there, clinging on to everything I believed in. The one thing I would say about this context is what was happening a lot was donors were approaching them. And because they had good research systems, because they had an effective cultivation approach, they got to know a lot about the donors very quickly and got engaged very quickly. 5 years ago, if a donor had approached them, they would have been rubbish. So I think these systems have a real role, but they really have a role more as a reactive tool than a proactive one. So when the donors approach you, your good research, your ability to plan and react, your engagement repertoire, that will make the difference between them giving it to another cause or thinking that you're rubbish and actually giving you a 6-7 figure pound gift. So I am still hanging on to my toolkit, just saying, yeah, it's a great reactive toolkit. But anyway, that's reality. So there's a little bit about trust and a little bit about how you raise money from them. There is something about, just a little bit about the systematic approach to trust fundraising. And this I have never understood why it works. The best trust fundraisers that I've known, and Patrick's a great guy and he's going to, are slightly on the spectrum. I'd like to think I'm not bad at it. And what we are is we're incredibly detailed, this and that, with like our little segments, and we're very, very systematic. We can be quite charming on top of it if need be, but actually scratch this underneath and we're very little humming noises going on of an electronic system. That's us. And the reason why I think we function well in trust fundraising with this very, very systematic approach to doing things is because trusts are like that. And I'll never forget years ago meeting a guy whose job it was to identify the characteristics of the people who created charitable trusts. What a wonderful job. He was hired by the Charities Aid Foundation, who at the time made a lot of money about managing people's trusts, to go out and find out what type of person creates a trust so we can target these type of people and sell them our services. And he said to me, there's one characteristic to these people that's common. It wasn't wealth, it wasn't heritage, belief system. It was something about them as people that he said they all had. And I said, come on, tell me. As a fundraiser, this is gold dust to me. Let me have this. And I plied the man with coffee, and eventually he started to sing like a bird. And he said the best way of describing this characteristic, and bear in mind, folks, we've got to replicate this characteristic in myself, was he said, I went to the house of one person, very, very, very wealthy, guy, who'd set up a trust. And we got on quite well. And I went into his bathroom, which was kind of the size of this room. And and there's a mirror there, and alongside the mirror is a little sort of 5-bar gates, a little tally. And I know we had a relaxed conversation. He said, well, I'm really intrigued. What's with the tally by your bathroom mirror? And he said, well, what I'm intrigued about is whether I get more shaves out of a Gillette blade than one from Boots. Now my Boots blades cost me £2.66 for 10. I think the Wilkinson sword ones are something like £3.50. But I'm really intrigued as to which gives me the most. And he said, do you know, at the moment, I get more shaves out of a Wilkinson sword, but per penny, the Boots one's a better value. And he's sitting there thinking, you don't need to save, and the total, he was looking at saving himself £3.30 a year. But think of the psychology. And the psychology is, I go into detail about every aspect of my life. I like order, I like value, I like precision. I'm a tidy person. So I think we as trust fundraisers are incredibly tidy people. And so I think that's a real key thing to where we go with this, is if you're a tidy person, you'll thrive with trust fundraising. Thrive with it, because that's what they do. Let me just quickly whiz on. I'm just going to do some stuff here. I'm kind of slightly stalling a bit, because when I looked in here and looked at my slides, I realised that actually they're absolute rubbish. And the whole point I was trying to do earlier was I'm going to try and do it. But I know that you guys at the back will not have a clue what's going to be on this screen, because it's kind of not come up big enough. Quickly to go on to something about these trusts and their accountability. Every trust has to file its accounts at the Charity Commission every year, so you can get 5 years of their accounts in PDF, downloadable, free of charge. So if you're looking at a prospect, you can really sit and chew through their accounts and find out what they're doing. And this one here is called the Mulberry Trust. Now what we're going to look at first is actually the key document is their Statement of Financial Activities. And the Statement of Financial Activities is basically how do they get their money in, what do they do with it. You as independent, you have to register these as well. What's going on here, trust me, is this line here, this is income and this is how they spent it. This line here is fairly consistent, and it's their investment income. And investment income is normally derived from dividends from shares, not share values. It's normally the dividends that they get from shares. And this figure is 2009, 188, 2010 is 185. And this is one of the real factors about charitable trusts, is the majority of their income comes from dividends. And by and large, dividends are pretty stable. So their main income feed is going to be pretty robust, plus or minus 18%. But what we've got in here is, wow, in this line here, this is gift of shares. We've got a dollop of £478,000 has come into this trust. Now, this is something I'll spend my life doing, is looking at where do they get their money from. And if I've got a trust whose only form of income is investment income, I know that it's going to be pretty much the same each year. So your opportunity to get more or to get in is really limited. And we call them the living dead. You know, they're zombies of the trust world. This one, it isn't a zombie. This has got a twitch of life about it because it's had £500,000 worth of income coming in. Well, that's interesting. So that's just quickly those terms. I'm not going to go into too much. Now I'll have a look at where they give their money to. And you don't need to have to look at the detail here. But what you see is a very interesting set of, there's a chunk you get income 2 years on the trot, but there's quite a nicer chunk of new, those people new that year, not new this year. There's other people who've been funded in 1 year, not in the previous year. And I'm quite intrigued with this trust because it's clearly not hanging on to the same people each year. It's funding people, dropping them, bringing new people in. And those are the sorts of trusts that you should be, that are really good targets. Because if they're coming into new money, they're likely to change their beneficiaries and the profile of the giving they're getting. So the moment I see a trust with dollops of income coming in from gift of shares, voluntary income, then I start to take an interest because it's pretty likely that their lists of grants, this is 2010, this is the previous year, will be different. So immediately I'm thinking opportunity. Now I picked Mulberry, I don't know why, because I think I quite like the name. And this one here is Sherborne Girls' School, bursary fund. So there's a school in there alongside everybody else. Crisis, Dystraxia, all the mainstream welfare charities are just stuck in there is a private school. So that's one type of trust. So look out on these accounts and look out for the ones that are alive. Injections of money will mean the grants will change.
But isn't there a risk with that? That then every year, if all you get are trusts who change their donors every year, then every year you're having to go out and find new trusts?
Yeah, but there's a sort of carousel nature to them that actually this is quite an important factor. And again, I hear that I'm use trust language with you. A lot of trusts talk about their hardy annuals. So if you're a hardy annual, you will always be funded by them. And quite often hardy annual gifts are determined by the founder of the trust and actually don't increase. So in 1938, the founder decided to give you £1,000 a year. you're still getting £1,000 a year in 2013. So they think of hardy annuals, and then perennials. And perennials are people that they fund 1 year, drop them 2 years, bring them back again. So I do think you've got to accept that you will be in a carousel. So you'll have a few hardy annuals, but then you've got to accept with a lot of others you'll be 1 in 3 years, 1 in 4 years. But just because it's that infrequent doesn't mean to say they'll never fund you again. And then there's others who just take a taste, go, that was interesting, but never fund it again. Let's have a quick another one. I had to do this one. What a wonderful name. The Craps Trust. This is its income. You saw the other one, it has a few lines for income. This is the total summary of the income. Investment income. That's all they get. And in 2012 it was 177,000. In 2013 it's 182. I've got figures going further back and a bit further forward on this. This is, in terms of income, possibly one of the most boring trusts in Christendom. It's not healthy, it's the same each year. There's no dollops of income coming in. It's the same. So what do you think the grants are going to look like? Any calls? You think it's that boring in the way they get their income that they are absolutely terribly tedious when it comes to how they... Maybe? Let's have a look. You're not wrong, are you? Look at that. Every bar 2 organisations, every single organisation has got the same amount of money each year. And that is, it's an extreme example, but it's a byproduct of where they get their money from. There's a boring predictability in their money that translates itself into a boring predictability in terms of where they spend their money. This is another interesting one. This trust is actually quite, it's a Jewish trust, but there's schools in here as well. Which I was, again, quite surprised with. Again, picked purely randomly. So there you are, that's point number 1. If you're going to try and do a prospect, look at all these things about what they're interested in, your locality, education, disadvantaged people, all that side of things, but then go beneath it and look at the mechanics of their money. And look for the people that have got flexibility in their money as prospects because they can increase and allow people in, and think hard about a craps. Because if you're funded by craps, short of murdering their children, I don't know how you'll stop getting the funding. But if you're not funded by craps, I do not know how you get into them. It's a tough one. So you can see just reading the numbers can tell you a huge amount as to who's hot and who's not. We're just going to do, for the last 5 minutes, I'm going to take you with you through 3 minutes, 1 minute. 1 minute. 1 minute. This is quite an important piece. And Patrick, you're spared. Partly because of the numbers of people here, I haven't got enough. This is a piece of work I did a few years ago, which was looking at application forms on charitable trusts. What do they have in common? Because I thought all these application forms are really different. So why are they different? So what I did was I got together 100, I don't know why I like the figure 100, I got 100 application forms together. And I cut up their questions so you couldn't tell which question came from which application form, and spilled all these slithers of paper onto my table. And what I was looking for was, in all these random questions and all these forms, is there a pattern? Because if we can find a pattern underneath 100 forms, we have the key to what trusts without application forms are likely to ask you, and then a sort of body of information that's transferable for any application form. So what we've got here is that Each application form has 14 questions at the bottom of it. Can we finish at 5 past or? It's 12? Oh, sorry.
These will be online.
Yeah, yeah. First question is they want to know how many people will benefit. Second question is they want to know what is the specific need. Is it about people with disabilities, people with disadvantage? Is it about certain areas of study? So they want qualitative information. They want to know what is your overall aim. And this is quite critical. They want to know how you engage your beneficiaries in the design of your programs. So are you a do-to or a do-with? And then they want to know how your particular thing fits in with the work of other people. And this is quite an important question to you guys about the connectivity of what you do in other areas of people's lives. They want to know how you're relevant to them. And then they want to know clear project information. I want to know, what does the project achieve? How do you do it? What's the timescale? And how much money do you want? And then I want to know, how will you monitor that? So how will you know what you're hoping to achieve in number 7? 12 is evaluation. 13 is how do you fund it in the long run? And 14 is, if it's one-off, how will other people learn about it? And that's the nub of a good proposal. So if you can capture all that information in a proposal, you have what these guys are after. And again, that's coming from a study of 100. Janice, I'm done.
Sorry, I was sorry to cut
Yeah.
you short.